Okay, morning everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks for registering early enough that you could get to the 9 a.m. session. That's fantastic. This session is all about operating at scale and how you can prepare for your cloud journey. Hopefully we're all going to learn something together today. But to start off this session, I'd like to start off with a quote. So I'm just going to leave that on the screen for a second, just for you guys to have a quick look at. So the role of the musician is to go from concept to full execution. Put another way, it's to go from understanding the content of something to really learning how to communicate it and make sure it's well received and lives in someone else. So this might seem like a bit of an unusual quote to start to talk about operations with, but hopefully I'm going to explain during the course of this how this relates to what we're going to talk about today. So we hear a lot about the benefits enabled by the use of cloud. Innovation, agility, security, reliability. But there's a lot more to getting those benefits than just signing up for the service. Along with the migration to cloud comes the requirement to align the way that our organizations work with this new flexibility and this new agility to really, take advantage of what's on offer from cloud services. So what we want to talk about today is a few different things, really. We're going to talk about the way we approach our first steps to cloud migration and how these first steps should be viewed through a change in the way we work, a change in the way we do things. So we're going to give you a number of practical, technical recommendations about ways you can set up your accounts and ways you can lay things out. And we're also going to talk about some sort of key tenets of how you can think about how to change your processes and your organization so that you can really start to get the best out of your move to cloud. And in order to do that, we need to bring people along with us. So if you're in this room, if you're interested in doing this, you're a leader within your organization for the cloud migration. And as part of that leadership, in order to make this change successfully, we need to be able to communicate these benefits and these changes to the people around us in our organizations. So, and this is kind of where I want to come back to the quote. We need to think a little bit like musicians. It's not enough for us just to understand technically how we do these things. We've got to understand them at a level that we can communicate within our organizations and allow others and the people we work with to see the benefit of these changes. And if you can do that, that's really the way you can make these changes a success. So we have a few goals for today. We're going to start off talking about some principles around account layout, what that does for you, how you might want to lay those out. Then we're going to move on to a little bit of talk about what we call organizational architecture. And what we mean when we say this is the way our organizations are laid out, the way our organizations work with cloud, and how you can start thinking in ways that are going to make these changes to enable us to work in this agile fashion. And then for the last part of the session, we're going to talk about an account model. So we're going to give you some practical guidance on ways you might want to think about laying out your account structure and how those accounts are going to help you, do your governance and get your compliance right and really make a success of your move to cloud.
Can I get that? Thank you. Go for it. So what are your first steps? Where do you begin? Well, you've signed up for an account. You've put your credit card details in, maybe turn that into a payer account so you can use a purchase order. And you've identified an application that you think is a really good candidate to move to the cloud. You've done your due diligence behind it, and you've put in all that effort behind getting that project moving along and getting the buy-in from all your stakeholders, and you've got your first application across. And it's seen as a huge success. Everybody's loving the fact that you've managed to move it over, that you're saving money, you're saving time, you're not having to run all this tin. You've got a lot of your services out there and doing things that you need them to do. Then comes along the next application. And that application is for the same area that you're working in. It's the next project, and you're bringing more and more of those workloads across. And that success is being seen across the business. So another business unit comes along and says, I've seen you've been doing this really cool thing over here. Can you come help us do the same for the next project that we want to bring over? And you think, yeah, well, okay, we'll put in a second account to accommodate that business unit. And what I'll do for this application, though, is we'll refactor some of it. Well, think of it in terms of making the application more loosely coupled. So take a microservices approach or serverless. So you've got your various services and the APIs that they interact on. And once again, it's another huge success. And that business unit is growing and thinking, right, well, what else can we bring across? So they bring their fourth application over with them. And that's really the beginning. You're in a position where you're now starting to snowball and things are growing, but what's your next step? Because that can grow really, really quickly. It can get quite out of control very, very quickly. And where are the governance? Where's the stakeholders? Who are the people that you need to get on board to make things successful? And it's a journey. It's actually a bit of a spectrum. So you go from that one account, you got your 2 accounts, 3 accounts, 4 accounts. You end up with maybe even a position where you're in thousands of accounts. But you've got to find that sweet spot for you, the kind of the happy place for you to be able to build out your infrastructure accordingly.
So we want to talk now about some of the reasons why you might want to separate things between accounts. Why is one not enough? Why would we want to separate these different services and business units into different accounts? So the first and probably one of the most obvious reasons is we can separate accounts for our teams. So we might have one team working on one thing, and we will create an account for that team and contain all of the resources and all of the items that they're using within that account. And that creates a nice, defined boundary around those teams and in terms of their resource usage in AWS. And again, because these accounts are isolated, it gives us a number of benefits in terms of things like blast radius. So an account provides a natural security boundary. By default, nothing can talk outside of an account. It's an entirely self-contained entity. So for things like change, if we make a mistake in a change, if we do something wrong, it will be isolated within that account and won't affect the rest of our infrastructure. So in terms of that sort of isolation, again, we might want to use accounts to provide that. And again, moving on from that, security. So again, if we have some kind of security incident, if someone manages to break into an account, that is a self-contained entity, and it limits the blast radius of that security incident. We can also, actually, I've gone slightly too far. The other thing about security controls is obviously our account permissions and our IAM permissions live within an account. So again, it allows us to specify groups of users who can do things in those specific accounts. The other thing might be business processes. So for example, we may have a business process that runs across multiple teams or multiple business areas, but we want to think of that as one process. And by aligning accounts to business process, we can do a few things that we can't really do in the on-prem world. So if we have an account that aligns to a business process, we can find out precisely how much that business process costs us, because everything that process uses is contained within that account, and it generates a separate bill. Now, you can't really do that on-prem because of things like shared infrastructure, and shared hardware. You can never really tell exactly what particular processes are costing you. So, that can be quite a big benefit. And again, moving on from that, billing. If you're doing internal cross-charging and things like this, keeping things in accounts makes that very, very easy, because each business unit is going to generate its own bill, and you'll be able to pick out that resource usage and that cost.
So what are the pros? So the pros for taking this approach, you can completely secure your resources, so you've got that wrapper around them. You've got that, as James said, the smaller blast radius for your services. And then you've got your simplified billing approach. So you can say, I know that this cost for these accounts goes to this business unit or this area of the business or this project team. But the cons for that are that you're having to deal with greater complexity. So you've got a greater distribution of your code. You've got to set up and operate in a different way because you're having to build out more and more accounts to accommodate that. And then you've got more complexity in your security policies, in how you view them and work across them. However, all of those cons are actually really powerful statements of this is why you need to automate. This is why you need to make your processes less involved with humans and more involved with your code and how you deliver and how you think about your account structures, the software that you're delivering, and the people that are involved in those processes as well.
So that's a little bit about some reasons why you might want to separate things into accounts, and some ideas about how you can think about dividing your services up and where you might want to put those boundaries. So we want to talk a little bit now about thinking about how you architect for cloud and ways of thinking about that. So we're going to reference the well-architected framework, which is an internal AWS framework that's published online. You can do this. You can speak to your SAs, your TAMs, and run well-architected against your workloads. And what this is it's a consistent approach to reviewing our architectures and making sure that they're going to work well with cloud. So as you can see here, there's a number of pillars within well-architected. So operational excellence, security, reliability, performance efficiency, and cost optimization. But what we want to focus on here is operational excellence, how we run our services. So the operational excellence pillar in well-architected is quite a new thing. It was introduced towards the end of 2017. And what it focuses on is establishing the foundations that are going to enable long-term operational success. So let's have a dig into some of the principles that lie behind that. So the first thing we think about here, and again, this is a biggie, is we want to perform operations as code. And what we mean by that is automation. We want to automate as many things as we possibly can. And this has a number of benefits. So it gives us perfect replicability of our actions. If we've got something automated, we know it's going to happen exactly the same way every single time we do it. And that's a huge benefit. We get away from changes to that process and how it works that cause errors. And along with that, it also limits human error. We all make mistakes. I've made mistakes during changes. By removing that human factor, again, we're reducing risk and making sure that what we say is going to happen is what actually happens. And again, if we automate things, it gives us the ability to run those actions in response to events in our environment programmatically. So if we've automated a lot of our operational processes, we can react to events happening programmatically. Self-healing, we can fix things using the code. So as an example of what some of this automation can do for you and the benefits you can give, there's a UK government agency who's one of Paul's customers, actually, and here at the summit today. They've managed to reduce their deployment times for new services from 2 days to an hour. A huge decrease. And their end-to-end environment build has been reduced from 4 weeks to 2 days. So, what you can do with that extra time and the extra business benefits you can give with that extra time is absolutely huge. And by doing this, we're bringing value into these platforms much more quickly than we would have been able to otherwise. The next thing we want to talk about is annotated documentation. This is a little bit of an unusual term. I admit, before I got involved with this, I'd not heard this one. What it means is our human-readable docs, so our architecture documentation. We want to put machine-readable information into these documents. So what I mean by this is, for example, if we're looking at our architecture documentation, we might tag every single diagram in there with a version number. And then as part of our change process, when we make these changes, we can programmatically go into those documents and make sure that all of our diagrams are up to date. They've all got the new version. And this works really well for giving us a single version of the truth. Again, I'm sure we've all had experiences where the documentation doesn't necessarily match reality. And what this does is allows us to get away from that and make sure that all of our documentation is up to date and really shows what's actually out there. We also talk about making frequent, small, reversible changes. So because we're doing things automatically, because we've got this automation, because our change process is now much more flexible, rather than having to build things up into these big bang changes that we do every so often, we can make a lot of small changes very often. And again, there's a huge number of benefits to doing this. So, these changes are doing good things, we hope. They're fixing bugs, they're adding new features. So by increasing the speed at which we do that, we increase the speed at which our environments improve. we can add more improvements more quickly. And again, because the changes are smaller, if something goes wrong, if we need to troubleshoot something, it's much easier to pin down exactly what's going to have caused that, because our changes are much more focused. So it makes troubleshooting a lot easier. And both of those things, again, combine to help us reduce the risk that's in our environment. And again, this comes along with that one, really. We want to refine our operations procedures frequently. So once we make these changes, we can start to build on these and start to refine our processes in order to improve them and make them better as we go along.
Yeah, so one of the big things about refining those operation procedures is that they bring value into the estate much more quickly from an ops perspective, but it also means the operations can respond to business changes. And that response to the business changes is actually really, really important to being in step and in sync with what's going on around you. Then you've got anticipating failure. Well, with failure, you've always got a number of known scenarios, and then you've got those, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, the known knowns and the known unknowns, or unknown unknowns, or one of those ones. You've always got somebody in the team who has seen all the things that have gone wrong in the past, and they're your naysayer. They're the ones that are sat in the corner going, it's never going to work, and this is why it's not going to work, and this is why it's not going to work, and this is why it's not going to work. Take that valuable information, bring it into any of the workloads that you're starting to move across to the cloud, and look at your application stacks in a way that through those lenses of how it's going to fail, why things are going to go wrong, what are the possible scenarios that could impact your workload and ultimately affect your production outcome for your customers and for your business. And when you take that view, you start to identify those single points of failure. You start to identify the areas where processes are letting you down. You start to say, right, actually, well, we can deal with this situation by automating that response instead of having to wait for a human to get involved. So we're taking out 2 hours of wait time here to get back up and running. A really powerful way of doing that, we've got a concept of game days. So we can run game days in partnership with you. Or you can build out your own. And with a game day, what you do is you take an application and you slowly develop it through the day. From a business perspective, you pull in all of the teams that you need to be involved in the process. And at different points during that day, we just inject some entropy in there to say, right, okay, this has failed, or this business situation has changed and you have to respond. And one of the great things about that is you get to see failure scenarios in a different light. You get the gentle pressure of the situation you're in. And another really big part of it is that you get the opportunity to engage with teams that you wouldn't necessarily engage with. So the guy who's sat opposite you in a different department is the guy that's actually helping you out in this scenario right now. So there's a lot of building of relationships in those kind of things. So definitely recommend trying to get your head around failure by running through scenarios and making it more interactive and more social in that regard. And then once you've done all of that, something will go wrong. You will have a failure at some point, and people will say, well, why did that happen? You've done all these tests, you've looked at all these different scenarios, but what is absolutely critical in this scenario is that you actually learn. It's fine to say you've got something that's gone wrong, but when something does fail, have actions, have accountability, make a plan, and build on it. And as a result, I think it's important to take that and say, right, what went wrong today? We don't want to allow that to happen again in the future. Can you click? So I like this quote. Don't let the failures of today be the reasons of failure for tomorrow. Take that opportunity to learn and be accountable and responsible for the things that have gone wrong, and look at what you can do to mitigate the same thing happening again in the future. And if there's a lesson learned in there in terms of other aspects of your estate, build on that. Use that to improve your overall environment. So when your journey begins, you start by preparing. Then you move on to actually operating your environment. And you evolve. And it's a continuous cycle. An important part of that is beginning that journey is setting your operational priorities. So your operational priorities are going to be things like business requirements, requirements around the end product. You may have regulatory requirements that are imposed upon you, compliances from external parties, internal compliance that you need to meet the demands of. And all of that's absolutely essential to setting out what your goals are going to be and what direction you need to move in. The next step is to design with operations in mind. So a big part of operations in a classical sense is very much a project has delivered a piece of work. They're handing that piece of work off to an operations team. The operations team says it's operationally acceptable and I'm going to live with that, and it fits into our processes. Designing with operations in mind takes a slightly different approach in the sense that what you're trying to do is build as much of that up front as part of that workload, that product, that project, and say, right, what are the standards, procedures that you're using today to deliver your code, and how do we factor our operations into those processes? And also the guys who are developing the code understand what it's like to have to live with it, because you spend most of the life of a product is in operations, or hopefully it is anyhow. So if it's not, then that's a failed product. However, if you can get the people who are developing that application, building that application out, growing that application, to understand what needs to be done in order to run it, and you bake that in way up front, you're shifting everything over to the left, you're making your life a lot easier in the long run, and you're also sharing with the rest of the business an understanding of what operational pain can be sometimes. And that's a really important part of the sustainability of an environment. And then there's operational readiness. So operational readiness is, it's about getting to the stage where you understand what your workload looks like, what your responses to that workload is, what your day-to-day tasks are in order to maintain that successful operation of the environment. You'll have things like runbooks and playbooks. You'll be having various scripts and codes that you have to run in order to keep things ticking over. A really good guide, just Google it, is the Cloud Adoption Framework. There's a lot of really good best practice in terms of how you get ready from an operational perspective.
Okay, so I want to talk now a little bit about some of the sort of softer aspects of doing this. So we've heard some, technical things we can do here and how we can start to think about architecting our services. But making the move to cloud, as we mentioned earlier, also requires some changes in the way we work. And as an example of this, there's a customer that I work with who's the Met Office in the UK, who are an organisation who looks after weather forecasting, a government service. And one of the services they run is a thing called the National Severe Weather Warning Service. And what this thing does is sends out alerts if there's going to be any kind of severe weather. So if it's going to snow, if it's going to be very windy or whatever, this thing sends alerts to a number of consumers. So, individual end users, government agencies, there's a lot of commercial customers of this. But the thing that really interests me about this is it's a very spiky workload. Clearly, if, it's a bright sunshiny day outside, it's not doing anything. But if it's going to snow tomorrow, everybody's on this thing, everybody's looking at it, so it's extremely busy. Now, what the Met Office did with this was, obviously, they had a lot of hardware hanging around to run this service. And they've re-architected it, moved it into AWS, and now it's all on a pay-as-you-go basis. So the service used to cost them around £200,000 a year to run, and now it costs them around £4,000. So a huge cost decrease. But the thing that's really allowed them to do that isn't technical. It's not a technically complex service. The thing that's let them do it is having the culture across their organization that's allowed, their security team to understand what Lambda is and how it can be used and how it can be secured. It's from their finance team to understand how a pay-as-you-go model works, and that they're not necessarily going to be able to forecast what cost is in advance and be accepting of that. So I want to talk about how we can work within our organizations in that way, and let us really take advantage of some of the innovation that we can do. So the first thing to say on this front is these aren't changes really that we can proceduralize. We can't, issue a process that says we are now working like this, because people don't work like that. It's not the way that you make those changes. So we can't force the change, but what we can do is create the right conditions for these changes to emerge. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about, we have to act as examples of these things. The way we act and the way we do things is catching. And if we go off and do these things within our organizations, if we really focus on the services we're trying to deliver and explaining to people how these things work and how they're going to benefit us, we can bring people along with us to really start working in this way. And there are some technical things we can do here. So for example, making sure we have everything templated in CloudFormation so we can deploy very quickly. And this lets people experiment safely and cheaply. And again, starts to build that culture of innovation and of people trying new things and not being afraid to fail. So things like that can be extremely powerful. We've talked earlier about with our applications and services, we can make small incremental changes. So we can also be agile about introducing agile processes. We can do this with cultural change as well. Making small changes over a longer period of time, really helps with the success of making these changes and makes it easier to introduce them. And that kind of leads on to the next point, which is we will need to educate across our organizations. When we're thinking about training, when we're thinking about these training opportunities we have, we tend to think about our technical organizations and technical training. But bringing in people from other teams to show them what we're doing and show them how it works is incredibly powerful. So, bring in your finance people, bring in your security people, let them see what you're doing and understand how it works. So then, when we really do need to do something and we need to do it fast, they're going to understand us and they're going to be in a much better position to help us out. And again, similar to that, we need to live and breathe collaboration. Silos are endemic in most organizations. We're almost comfortable working with the people we work with day to day. And stepping outside of that can be quite uncomfortable. And silos can exist between teams, between departments, sometimes between people sat at the same desk. But we really need to break these things down. And if you can be the person who steps outside and starts to work with people who we wouldn't normally work with, it's an incredibly powerful position to be in. Now, this one can be a little bit tricky sometimes. Embrace constructive criticism. We've got constructive in brackets there for a reason. Whenever you go into an organization with the aims of making these changes, you're going to get variable levels of enthusiasm from various people. And you're going to get some very vocal critics of what you're trying to do. Now, one of the reasons we want to introduce these processes is, as we were saying, we want to remove blockers. We want to remove silos. And quite often, people who vocally disagree with you are actually signposting things that you can fix. People don't say these things for no reason. There's usually something behind it that we can go away and deal with. And if you can get those vocal critics on side, if you can understand them and fix their problem, they're going to become your most vocal advocates. So focus on these people, lavish your time on these people. And again, that's really going to help you move forward. And the reason we want to do all of these things, what we're trying to achieve, is we want to build organizational trust. We want all of our teams within our organizations to understand each other and trust that people are going to do the right thing. And the reason we want to do that is because if our teams trust each other, we can remove layers and layers and layers of approvals that we need to get. And that lets us move much faster. So a phrase that I really love around this is guardrails, not gates. We want people to understand what the right thing to do is. We want to put configuration items in our organization that stop people going off the tracks almost without them knowing it. Because if we have to have approvals, if we have to have gates, we have to stop and we have to wait. And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid doing. So it's getting that organizational trust that really unlocks the benefits of cloud and allows us to move a lot faster. And finally, just to come back to a point that we keep reiterating because it's that important, incremental change is very powerful. If we try and do these things in a big bang approach, people are going to get defensive. And if people get defensive, they put up blockers, barriers, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. So, be subtle, make small changes, do these things gently and carefully, and it's going to go a lot better than if you try and, force this on people. So, your culture equals your values and your behaviors. Now, I'm sure all of our organizations have a set of values that we aspire to. But the key thing here is, do our behaviors match those values? It's all very well to have a list of very, fine things that we want to be doing, but if we're not living up to them, it's very obvious to everyone around us. And that isn't a recipe for success at all. Successful cultures focus on giving ownership to people and letting them live up to the values that we set. So, we really want to ensure that we're walking the walk as well as talking the talk. So, to round off the session, we're going to talk about some practical first steps. You've heard a lot of theory, but I'm sat there. I've been tasked with setting up my AWS organization. What should I do? So we're going to give you a bit of a model of an account layout and what that can look like and what each of the things you should set up is going to do for you. So, where do we begin? The first account that we should set up should be our organizational master account. So this is very top level. This is where all our control sits. This is the very first thing we're going to create. Now, there's some common things that people do with this account that you probably shouldn't. So quite a lot of people will use DX connections back to their data center, and they'll put the endpoints in their master account. Don't do that. We want to have as little in here as possible, really. This is going to be a break glass only account once it's configured, so we want to keep this to a bare minimum, only exactly what's required. We're going to implement service control policies in this account so that we can control the level of access that our other accounts are going to have and what you're going to be able to do within those. This is also the endpoint for our consolidated billing. So all of the accounts we're going to create underneath this, their bill will be centralized into this one account to give us that consolidation. So we've got one view of what our billing looks like. And again, once these things are done, shut it down. Don't let anybody have access. This should be break glass only. There's really no reason you should be going in here day to day. And again, one of the things that people often miss that sounds slightly unusual, we want to delete the organization's role in this account because it's our master. We don't need that, and it's much more secure without that. We always want to think about building this with security in mind. So once we've created that organizational master, we can move on to creating our core set of accounts, which are really going to control the way our organization works. So the first thing we want to set up is a logging account. Now, this is another break glass account. It's something that people aren't going to need to go into day to day, really. And what's going to happen here is this is where all of our logs are going to end up. And this is one of the reasons why we want to set this up first. So every other account we set up, all of the audit logs, all of the actions are going to end up in this logging account. Once we've done that and lock that down again, this is another break glass only account because it's going to be the record of what's happened and we don't want anyone to be able to go in and change that. We can then create a security account. And what the security account does is this is where we allow access to our security teams. This is where we let them do their work. So what we'll put in here, you can connect this back to your data center. I could see that's probably what's going to happen with this account. And we're going to put in security monitoring in here, so auditing tools, things that are going to go away and look at all of our other accounts. So this account is going to have cross-account read-write access to pretty much everything else we've got. So again, you want to limit the access to your security team and only the people who really need to be able to see that information. So once we've done that, we're going to create a networking account. Now, this is where your VPNs are going to end up. This is where our networking services are going to go. So if you're using things like CSI, you might put those in here as well, and your direct connect endpoints. And again, this is limited access. Once this is set up, there's no real reason to go in here. So, we're building these accounts that are very, very secure and very locked down for our basic services, for our core services. So, think least privilege about all of these things. So now we're starting to get into some of the more day-to-day operational accounts. This is where we really start to do some work and start to get some production in. So the shared services account, clues in the name. This is where all our shared services are going to work. So things that you might put in here, this is going to be connected back to our data center. You're going to put things like DNS in here, Active Directory, shared services, VPCs. This is where you might build your golden AMIs for deployment. You might have your deployment pipeline in here. So things like CI/CD might live in this account. And you see, we said scanning infrastructure here, and to separate that out from what's in the security account, this is more kind of housekeeping stuff. So we're thinking things like scanning for inactive instances, scanning for improper tagging, scanning for making sure we've got snapshots for everything and we're not hanging on to old snapshots we shouldn't have. And also, any monitoring tools you've got might live in this account as well. And again, this should be limited access, but it's going to be a broader set of people than the accounts we've set up previously. Those really are very limited access. This is going to have a wider group than that. But again, it shouldn't be, absolutely everybody. So after that, we're looking at a billing tooling account. Now, as we said earlier, the organizational master is the endpoint for our consolidated billing. But that's a great break glass account. We don't want everybody going in there. So we create the billing tooling account to enable people like our finance teams to go in and do reporting without needing access to that organizational master account. So again, they can look at all the billing, they can look at the usage metrics, you can do RIs in here, and this account really should be limited to your finance team and people who are going to look at that reporting and use that information. And finally, we have an internal audit account. So this is kind of similar in a way to the billing tooling account. What this does is it gives read-only access to people like auditors to go and look at our security logs. So again, very limited access, a very specific set of people, only the people who really need to see those, but it allows us to have those logs in a separate account where they can't be touched and no one can make any changes, but still give people access to what they need to see. So once you've got those accounts, you've got that organizational structure that allows you to do your governance, allows you to make sure you're doing compliance properly. And those are the core set of accounts. So once we've got these, we can then move on to doing some more interesting things and actually getting some production workloads. So I'll hand over to Paul to carry on with those.
Thank you. So yeah, this is the great foundation for you. You can you have a centralized repository where you start to build out all of the governance and controls that are in place. But on top of that, you start to build out the infrastructure that's there to enable your developers. So you give your developers an innovation space, a sandbox, and it's aligned to that developer. You want it to have a fixed spending limit so you can keep control of it, so you can run reports against it in your billing account. It needs to be autonomous. It needs to be for that developer to have space to play, grow, learn about new services, learn about how things work, experiment. Is this connecting?
No, it's not.
There. Then you need to start looking at in terms of, well, in this example, we're using business unit segregation. It might be as simple as other products or as big as you have many companies within your organization and you're going to break up that way. But this is a template for how they then build on the core services. Battery's starting to go on this. So in there, you'll place your first step in your software development lifecycle or your route to live. You're going to have that development environment where you're integrating all the code that your various developers bring to the table. And then you'll build out a pre-production environment. And now this has to be as production-like as you can possibly make it. The same instances, the same databases, depersonalized data in there, the same volumes of data for the kind of activities that you're testing against. It's a good place to start looking at how your automated deployments are working, the areas of controls and issues that you might be building out, and build out your view of your QA testing so you can see where things are going wrong, what it needs to be fixed in that space. Then you've got your production environment. Now, this one you'll want to have connected to your data centers. This one you will have all your production applications in this account. You'll promote your code from your pre-production environments as you would with your normal route to live. And you will limit the access. Now, the essential thing about limiting the access in this scenario is if you've got all of that automation right up front, you don't ever need anyone to log into this account. You click your button, your software gets deployed, and you are gold and your production is in there. And access to that account really should be break glass, because you don't want anyone going in and messing around with what is your crown jewels, the thing that keeps your business floating. And then this shared service one it's more aligned with your business unit activities. So these are shared services for your various applications, your core data, the common services that make all of the applications work well together. And the tooling that you use to support that as well is really, really important to have that shared services approach, so that you can continue to organically grow that out and build out the tools that support your application stack. And then another sandbox. Why another sandbox? Well, this, from a business unit perspective, it's different from the developer's space to play. So a developer will have a sandbox to learn about new tools, to learn about new technologies, to learn about things that bring business value to their role. This sandbox is more about doing the same from an organizational perspective. So look at it from the perspective of that business unit, of that organization within your group, and to say, right, what are the things that we need to experiment with for our application stack to make it better, to improve things, to get the product at the end of the day that is there for our customers and that justifies our existence. So it's that innovation space that brings all the various aspects of your product together. And finally, well, at the end of the day, you're going to have a structure you've got your organizations in place, that you're set up with a clear understanding of how the accounts beneath that are structured and controlled and billed against and tagged and logged and monitored. That centralized logging is really important. Having that audit trail of who's doing what, where, and when, which applications are doing what, where, and when as well, is really important to get valuable business insight. Having that centralized view of security as well means that when you're doing all of those incremental changes that James was talking about before, your security people are looking at that from the perspective of they're seeing the change at the security level, and they're seeing what they need to implement in terms of how they monitor and respond. So they check once, and you can redeploy the code that they've validated as many times as you want. So security has gone from being a blocker in some regards to an absolute enabler. You no longer have that checkpoint, that gateway that says, we've got to take this back and get this ratified. It's already ratified because you've done all of that work up front. So having security in that position is a really, really powerful thing, because you've got your enablement straight away. Building on the shared services aspect of things, you've got all of the tools there that form those foundations for your DNS services to the outside world and internally, your directory services for your users and the various aspects of your applications. Limit monitoring is a really important aspect, because if you're not paying attention to the limits that you're driving as your estate grows, you could hit a wall that will mean that I can't spin up this extra instance. So being able to monitor those limits means that you're on top of it. You're informed. You have actionable information. It's no longer just data sat in an account somewhere. You've got real information that you can build on. The billing tooling and the cost monitoring aspect, bean counters love that because you give clear insight into what your spend has been so far, what the trends are, how things grow. Getting that kind of buy-in is really essential, because people need to understand how they're spending the money and where that money has been spent. Having the sandbox promotes that experimentation and that freedom to play, and that's essential for that healthy culture stuff that James was talking about. And then building out your full route to live, that development, that pre-prod, the staging, and as many accounts and routes to live as you need for your organization it means that as a self-contained entity, you've got those foundations to grow. And this is a cookie cutter approach in many regards. You can say, right, well, we've got these core enterprise accounts. Now we're going to expand that out to our business units, and the business units can build on what is already there as part of your core. So the next steps are that everyone's on the same page. There's the common understanding, and the culture is starting to slowly move in that direction. Sometimes it's like nudging an oil tanker. You're gently moving things in a direction. And part of the way you do that is you empower people to succeed. You give them the tools that allows them to do their job and allows them to do it in an interesting way. And then your people just go off and build. So last week we announced the AWS Landing Zones tool. That's the link for it for further information. All of these slides are going to be published on SlideShare as well, so you'll be able to get the full deck if you need it. And a colleague of ours, Joe Healy, is doing a deep dive session on the landing zone approach, I think at 10 o'clock in one of the rooms around the corner. So it's well worth, if you're interested in that space, well worth getting into the nuts and bolts of what you need to do to get to that point where your account structures reflect your culture and your culture reflects your business objectives. And as we said earlier, we like criticism, constructive criticism, please. So please use the mobile app and provide us with some feedback as well, because that is the way we learn as well. And thank you very much for your time today. It's greatly appreciated.